Hello everyone and welcome to another update video. Before I start, just a few little things. First of all, I paused the Patreon in February and I explained at the time that in January I mostly just played games. I was waiting for the art department to catch up a little bit. And in February I did work, but I paused the Patreon because it wasn't related to this. Hopefully it's something you'll see someday, but it wasn't this. So this does not represent months and months of work, right? I've been back at it hard in April, and for a good bit of March. I spent some time playing stuff in March as well. But yeah, it's not from the start of the year. But despite that, I think there's been some very nice progress made. And as you can probably tell by the title of this video, there's not really any major new features. It's not like a video focusing on emitters or anything like that, but rather a bunch of updates and little things that kind of relate to all the stuff that I've shown previously, right? Another thing just before we begin is that you'll see there's kind of a ghost following me around here. Ignore that for now, right? I'll explain that at the end of the video. Okay, first things first, very important feature for debugging is that I can now actually pause the game. So that's useful and something that we probably want to have in the final thing as well, right? But it's going to be very useful in demonstrating the thing that I want to talk about first, which is something that came up on a stream a little while back. I think it was at the end of one of the Ghosts and Goblins streams or something. And I figure it deserves more of a spotlight because it's an interesting question, and for anybody who was watching at the time, you might like to know that I've addressed it. So if you watched the previous videos, you'll know that we have this state machine thing working, which means that we can smoothly change the player's state so they can do all kinds of different things. They can move around and uppercut and attack and all that kind of stuff, right? Or just jump or run or whatever, right? We want to make that as easy as possible to add new states into the system, right? But there is a question about when the exact state changes should occur, right? And I think the uppercut is the best example of this. So if I'm in an uppercut like I am right now, let's just say as a designer, we've decided that the uppercut is something we don't want to be able to self-cancel, right? So you can't just spam the uppercut button and stay in the air, like, you know, continually keep moving up in the air, right? You have to at least begin falling like this before you can uppercut again, right? So you have to actually press the button with a little bit of timing, right? Let's just say that's something we've decided as a designer. You don't need to say that whether it's good or bad from a design standpoint. Let's just say that that's what we want, right? Well, the way I see it, there are only two possible frames that make sense to allow the player to change into the uppercut again, right? To restart the uppercut. And that is either the last frame of the previous uppercut or the first frame of the falling animation, which comes after the uppercut. So imagine this is the last frame of the uppercut. I'm saying it's either this frame here or it's when we finally finish the uppercut. It's that frame there, the moment where we change into a falling state, right? So I don't have a word for this. I don't know if anybody's talked about this exact timing thing before, so maybe there's a term for it, but I've been thinking of it as the frame A, frame B problem, right? We either want to go on frame A or frame B, and those are really the only two valid answers because those are the only ones that fall on the knife edge of when we've decided we want the player to be able to uppercut again. Now, I said on the stream that I was leaning towards frame B, and I've leaned even harder in that direction since then. But I do think there's a case to be made for frame A in certain situations. And I think probably the most obvious answer to that would be if you have an attack string, right? You don't want the player to have to go into like some kind of very obvious recovery thing that looks totally different to the attack string before they can press the next button in the attack chain, right? That doesn't really make any sense. You want them to flow together and look like they're all kind of a natural set of animations that all link up with each other. So I think that the frame A thing makes sense in some ways, but I think frame B is better as a default. And I also think that frame B is more flexible in that it can kind of fake being frame A more easily than frame A fakes being frame B. What I mean is we could very easily, if we wanted to break the rules, right? If we wanted the uppercut let's say we have a frame B system, but we want the uppercut for whatever reason to be a special case that comes out on frame A, then we can kind of just bullshit it a little bit by coming up with another state that exists just for that time period where we can, pretend that that's its own little thing, and then the player is allowed to go, right? So it's kind of easier. I don't know if that's making sense, but it's kind of easier to move from a frame B scenario into a frame A scenario rather than vice versa. And I made this decision a while back while this game was actually frame A, right? So by default, everything was frame A. And I thought that getting it over to frame B was going to be a real headache. I'm kind of glad that I waited to solve the problem because I think that helped me get a nice, clean solution to this. So I'm happy with the solution that I got. And also, even better, is that it actually solved some other problems for me. So another example is if I've shown in previous videos, we have this interaction where we can do a vault, let's say, and then out of the vault we can do an uppercut, but the uppercut can only come out in the opposite direction, right? Well, if we do this in the frame A timing, let's imagine this is the last frame of the vault here. There was a window where if I pressed it with frame perfect timing, if I pressed the button on the very last frame of this thing before I went into this other, so this is one state here, right? Then when the bounding box changes, that's the green box. That's a different state, right? And that's the moment where the priority drops, right? So we say that when you're in the vault, that's an extremely high priority action. The uppercut can't cancel that. The uppercut is not higher priority, is not allowed to occur. And then when the character flips a little bit, that's when the priority drops drastically and it says, okay, now you're allowed to do other things. You might be allowed to slash or uppercut or whatever else, right? Well, we worked on the frame A scenario before where once this thing had reached its conclusion kind of internally in the system, then we say, okay, clearly the priority is like gone. It's okay. You can uppercut. But the problem is, if you did it with frame perfect timing, so you caught it right on the end of this state here, the uppercut was going in the wrong direction. It was going, in this case, it would go to the left, whereas we know we wanted to go to the right, right? We like that kind of thing where it goes one direction, then another, if you chain these two moves back to back, right? So it was going in the wrong direction, and the reason for that is quite simple. It's because there's a whole thing that happens during this vault where the character technically flips around, right? And the moment when they flip around is considered to be this vault recovery here. That's the frame where your X orientation flips, right? So if we can uppercut, we catch the thing right before that happens. That's why we uppercut in the wrong direction. So doing it in the frame B way, I mean, I'm not saying there's no solution for that in the frame A. I'm sure there is, but doing it the frame B way makes it much more clean, and I think it just kind of makes more sense to me. I didn't really give my argument for it, but there's two arguments, right? Two arguments in favor of this frame B approach, I think. The first one is that in the frame B approach, the player actually reacts to the visuals of the game rather than relying on some kind of meta knowledge about the uppercut lasting for 48 frames or whatever it is, right? The audio visual thing plays into it, and I think that's a key part of games, basically, that it's a loop between the player and the feedback that they're getting from the game, right? So I wanted that, but also I think it makes sense if we have these situations where, say, the priority is dropping here like this, and maybe we want to chain moves under these circumstances. I think it just kind of makes sense to let the new state do its thing for a full frame internally. And then we're not in any kind of like quasi, we're in the vault, but we're kind of in the vault recovery as well. Like our priority has dropped, but we haven't flipped the player's X orientation, right? That's very messy, right? If we just let this thing have its way for one frame, then all of a sudden the state becomes a lot more clarified internally and all that kind of stuff. And I think it just makes more sense. So it's frame B by default, and like I said, I think if we wanted to do attack strings or something, we could come up with a solution that would let us do the frame A thing, let us get away with, interrupting our own attacks earlier than it, the animation ending and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not worried about that at all. And that's the frame B problem solved as far as I'm concerned. Who knows, it might need a little bit more nuance, but it got in a nice clean solution, and I'm very happy with that. The next thing I'd like to show relates to the screen transitions. Previously, they just were an interlude that just covered the screen with black, right? That could have actually been any color. That was something I could do before, is I could make it red or whatever if I wanted to. But now it can have a texture as well, which means that we can do more complicated things. When we combine how the screen changes with an underlying texture, we can do something a lot more overt and a lot more stylish, but overt, this isn't going to be stylish, but overt anyway, like this, right? So it's a very obvious thing that's happening, the whole screen filling up with these colored dots and then fading away. Now, for the type of game that we're making, if you've been following along on the Patreon, that might not be suitable. I'm not sure. Like those kinds of transitions, they're a bit too stylish for what we're going for. But for example, we might want to do something like this, where we have something similar to what we had before, but we have a more subtle underlying texture, right? And this is supposed to... This is my 2 seconds in MS Paint Beetle Samurai, right? So there he is. So we might have some kind of logo or some kind of faint thing built into the transition, or we might even get it to scroll a little bit. Like if we had a pattern, we could get that to scroll, or we could do something more subtle. The point is just about having options, right? We can do really garish, in-your-face stuff, right? Like where we're calling attention to the screen transition, or we can do more subtle stuff where it's something that, like, if your eyes glaze over the second you walk out of a room, maybe you don't even notice it, but it's there, right? It's a little bit of visual intrigue for players who see it. We can have that either way. I don't know. It's a nice. I think it adds a lot to it. Like there's a lot more stuff we can do with it now just by having textures, because we can make the texture line up with how the screen transitions and do all kinds of things that way, Another thing that I want to show off is Destructibles. These are not fleshed out at all yet, but they're in. And this is just kind of showing a benefit by having everything related to hitboxes. In a previous video that I showed, you saw the red square earlier. That's a hitbox. And if I start here and slide, you can see how most of the pots there don't break because they didn't actually get hit by the hitbox. The hitbox on the slide doesn't come out until a little bit further in, and they didn't get destroyed. These are obviously just programmer art. They're not even properly animated or anything like that. But it just goes to show we can have something that sits there, and then when it's hit by a hitbox, it animates and does whatever it needs to do. And pretty simple stuff. So I won't dwell on that. That's pretty straightforward. This room is monochrome and scan lines, but there's not actually anything new about that. It's just good to have a room with some shaders in to test them out. There's actually a problem with the monochrome shader that I never bothered to figure out, but when you have something related to opacity, it's not factoring in opacity correctly. I don't know if you'll be able to see it on the video, but the ghost thing has still looks quite green on my end, so I'd have to fix that if I ever wanted to use it, but I don't know if I'm going to want a monochrome thing at all. Anyway, another thing which you may have noticed when I was walking out of the previous room is that the player's state is now preserved between rooms. So if I slide here, you can see that I slide into the next room, which is nice. I just think in some games you can really feel the difference that happens when you walk into a new level. Like you can kind of feel that the character has spawned in some place and they've all been reset and stuff, and I wanted to get rid of that. Again, kind of relates to what I'm going for with this thing. Specifically, I talked in the latest post about how I wanted to be grounded and all that kind of stuff, and the game is going to be very similar to Castlevania and Ghosts and Goblins, so it's going to be very gamey anyway, right? So anything that I can do to make it feel just that little bit more grounded, I think is a worthwhile inclusion. And I think making sure that your state persists between rooms like this is important. And when we play the classic Mega Man games, who doesn't jump through the boss door and see him floating there in midair for a second? There's something fun about that. Another thing, and this was kind of an emergent property of how I put these room transitions together. As you might have guessed, there's a trigger zone off screen on each side of the room, right? It's just a little volume that I drag into the room, and I hook up a few things to decide, what happens to the screen during this time, but also how fast does it happen, right? We probably want it to happen pretty fast. On the left there, when I was going back and forth, each of those was just 15 frames each way, I believe. That's the default figure that I've put in there. But that can be longer or shorter if we need it to be. So for whatever reason, let's say we're about to walk into a boss room or something, we might want the screen transition to take a little bit longer than usual, as kind of a subtle way of cluing the player in that something big is about to happen. Or we might want to display a more complex graphic on screen for whatever reason, and therefore we want to dwell on it a little bit longer. So we want to be able to stretch or, squash these things as needs be. And I actually only tried the other day. I realized that I could put a value of 0 in, which is how I'm getting into these rooms instantly. So if you've never used Game Maker, these are rooms, which in Game Maker terms is just different levels, right? So like a lot of engines, it assumes that your game is going to be broken up into discrete levels of some kind, and it's swapping between them here. Now, I don't know if we're actually going to get away with this in a final product, because there's just not a lot of assets in either of these rooms, Well, as you'll see in a minute, there actually is a fair few assets in that room on the right, but I don't know. There's obviously no art assets and all that kind of stuff, right? So because these zones are just something that I made myself, I don't see how Game Maker doesn't have any way of knowing that these two rooms are connected. So I imagine it can't do any kind of prefetching or anything like that. So it's probably just genuinely loading the game that quickly in one frame, loading the new room in one frame. And I don't know if that will hold up into the final release. But if it does, even after the effort I made to get those nice screen transitions happening, this might be what we do. This seems like the most grounded thing to do, right? Is to just have the character walk into another room and not really call attention to it. So we'll see. Maybe we'll want to do something a little bit more stylized, because it might be nice to give the player a breather for a second, or just indicate a passage of time even, or I don't know, something. But we'll see. But yeah, something we have the option of now anyway. I'll be curious to see how that holds up as we start throwing more and more stuff into the game. I don't expect it to be viable in the end product, but maybe I'll be surprised, and maybe we really can load stuff that fast. I don't know. Yeah. Well, like I said, I don't think the player character is going to be moving. Like, this slide is very fast, I don't think the player character is actually going to be moving this fast in Beetlejuice, but maybe we get to the edge and we jump into the next room like that, and that's something that we can preserve. Oh, look at this, our little buddies come up to meet us. Yeah, so this is showing off another thing, and again, it's not really something that took a huge amount of effort, but it's why if you think that the game is taking a while to develop so far, things like this are part of the reason why, which is we get nice wins if we do things properly, and hopefully this is a nice win, right? This is an intangible actor, so the player character is considered to be an actor, just in my terminology, and this is an intangible one, right? So we don't just need to have enemies, we can also have neutral characters or NPCs or whatever, and by sliding past it here, what I'm demonstrating is that we can see that there's a slide hitbox, but even if the slide hitbox overlaps with an intangible actor, it doesn't provoke any kind of reaction, right? Either from the little scarab itself or from the player character, right? Normally, as you saw in prior videos, if I slid into a candle or whatever, I would slide backwards, but that doesn't happen here. But apart from that, oh, by the way, don't mind that little glitchiness. That's just my debug camera. It's hooked up to the analog stick, and it doesn't massage that input at all. So it's very jittery. That's like everything that you would feel on the stick right there. But yeah, so it gets all of the benefits that like the player character has. It can animate. It's not there, and obviously that's programmer art as well, right? I hope that's obvious. It can animate, it can move around the world, it collides with everything in the same way that the player character does. It's just not, it just isn't going to interact with the player or enemies in that way. It's not going to provoke reactions out of them that way. So we get to use all the nice animation system and collision and all that and reuse it in a really nice way. Another thing you may have noticed as I was moving through this room is the camera is moving. And this is again like a trigger, right? It's a zone where as we move through the zone, the camera moves from one position to another. So let's say we have an area like this where there's a slope and maybe there's enemies off to the right that can hit you. They're on a wall or they're in the air or something like that, right? So they're on the right. We want the player to be able to see more of the right of the screen here, and we can position the camera by moving the camera over so that the player character is in the left. You can see that he's actually kind of in the middle of the slope, right? For the amount of slope that we can see, he's basically in the middle. So we're trying to give the player as much room to see in all the directions as we think will be necessary. And the camera can, it can go back to its original position, and it can clamp. There was actually some new camera settings in the very first room that I showed when I was uppercutting, because that room is actually very tall, but it was staying on the floor because sometimes we just want to lock to the floor, like Super Mario Bros, right? We don't want to be following Mario as he jumps up on blocks all the time if there's actually nothing up there, right? Because it's kind of best to minimize the amount of camera movement you do and keep everything on screen, and avoid blind jumps by, if you're up halfway through the screen, you still want to be able to see this floor, right? Because you want to know what's down there. So if we want, we can clamp the camera into certain zones that it can't go higher or lower than. We can move across nice and smoothly, and we can set a specific curve on these things. By default, it's using an easing in and out curve so that it flows kind of smoothly between each position. And we can pick whatever curve we want and whatever kind of variables we want. Now, one thing about these camera zones is going to be a little bit hard to describe, but I think is an interesting kind of design problem, is there are a couple of ways you could do these, right? And imagine when I walk into this room, the camera gets some stuff by default, right? Just by walking into the room, the camera has some properties. Like this floor is actually goes down really far. As you can see, it's a slope on the right? So this room actually goes down really far, but we're only seeing the bottom two tiles because the camera is clamped there, right? That's something that we've had to decide as a level designer. We say, no, the camera doesn't move any lower than this at this part of the level, right? Now, when we walk into the camera zone, as you can see, it's starting to shift, right? So I'm actually in the camera zone now, right? As I walk into the camera zone, we could say, okay, whatever position the camera was in, just gradually add this much to it and subtract, like add this much on the x-axis and subtract this much on the y-axis and, clamp it here and here instead of there and there and all that, right? And that's a tempting way to do it as a programmer because it seems nice and clean. It seems like, oh, wherever I drop the zone in, it will always do the same thing, right? It will always do the same movement. But I actually think that's a problem. I think this is one case where it's actually better to use absolute values, right? And I'll explain why. Yes, it's true that if we set it up to be, I'm going to say relativistic, right? If we set it up to be relativistic, then it is always going to do the same thing, right? So if you say, okay, add like 20 on the x-axis this screen is something like 640 by 360, I think. So you're going to be adding something like 180 on the x-axis and, 90 on the y-axis, and that'll push the camera up about a quarter in each direction or something like that, right? So if you do that, yes, it's always going to move in that way as the player moves through the zone, but that could be a problem, right? The levels in this game are going to be pretty linear, but we might have a branching path or two, like we might have a place where you can take a high road or a low road, or we might have a place where there's kind of like, imagine you're moving up or down, maybe there's a left path and a right path, a left way to fall down and a right way. You can fall down from the ceiling a little bit earlier, or you can stay up top and fall down a bit later, something like that, right? We might have things like that where there are different places where we need to change the camera. And if the player does something that we don't expect as a level designer, they backtrack or they loop around in a way that we don't expect, then if the camera is out of position from where we expect it to be and we start adding values, then maybe we push the camera way out of position, right? Because if the camera is already up in the top right and we expect it to be in the middle, now if we start adding stuff to push it further up to the top right, the camera goes totally off screen and takes the player off screen, and now the player is screwed, right? Unless they backtrack and go back through the camera zone or something, right? Unless they realize what's happening programmatically and like, oh, okay, I need to go back here because Matthew just fucked that bit up, right? So I have to like compensate for his fuck up. Well, we don't want people to have to do that. So I actually use absolute values on these zones where it assumes that the camera is in a certain position. Like, let's say this is the leftmost part of the zone. It's going to assume that the camera is in a certain position here. And if the camera isn't there, it's just going to snap it there straight away. So it's all about like predicting what the worst case scenario is, right? If you use those relativistic kind of things, the worst case scenario is that the player loops around the level in such a way that the camera just keeps getting pushed around in ways you don't expect, and it goes off screen eventually, and they can't get it back, and they're screwed. They have to restart the level or whatever. But in this case, the worst case scenario is that the camera is out of position. The player did something that we didn't anticipate. We didn't actually catch it in the level design phase, and that's bad. Obviously, we'd want to avoid this either way, right? But the worst case scenario here is that when we step into the trigger zone, the camera snaps to where it's supposed to be. So it'll snap and it'll look a bit weird. It'll be like, whoa, like it'll all of a sudden just snap to where it's supposed to be. And the player might go, whoa, what happened there, But that's a much, like that, as far as worst cases go, that's much more acceptable than having it just gradually drift off screen because they did something we didn't expect, So this actually doesn't use any kind of relative things. It's just setting the camera exactly the way it wants to on each side of the zone, and then it's moving it, it's interpolating it in between the zone, and then when you leave the zone, it's reached its endpoint, and that's it. So that's how we do the camera. I think it makes sense. I think it's a case where it would have been easy to do it the wrong way, because the wrong way is kind of more appropriate in programming the majority of the time, right? You kind of want to minimize the amount of work you're doing and like maximize your reuse value out of everything and blah, 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 blah. But actually, I think it's better to just have to say, as a level designer, you have to type in where you expect the camera to be and where you want it to go exactly. And if you're wrong, it's going to snap a little bit, but that's a much better case than if it drifts off screen. All right, I'm repeating myself here clearly. All right. So yeah, not a huge change, but hopefully that was interesting, at least the idea behind moving the camera. All right, I got you a box of fleas. Enjoy. Here's your box of fleas. All right, you actually haven't seen any enemies yet. Well, these guys have been in some form for a while, but they got a pretty big overhaul recently. And there's a reason there's so many of them on screen right now, and that's because I was putting the collision system through its paces, right? In the past, like I said, I did have some enemies in. There's actually a couple of other ones as well in very, very early stages that they don't really work very well, but they're just kind of test things anyway. But I've been playing around with enemies and trying to make sure that they behave properly and then blah, 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 right? And of course, the nice thing is they are actors as well, so they should be able to do everything the player character can do in terms of animating smoothly and moving around the world and all that. I did make one exception, or at least one exception, earlier. Before now, these guys had their own collision system. Enemies had their own collision system, right? My theory was that the player character collision system was just too expensive to use on enemies, right? Because it's very precise. It moves pixel by pixel, and it does a lot of checks to make sure that you don't sink into stuff and blah, blah, blah. And it allows you to go up slopes, and that's a little bit complicated. And it's doing a lot of checks. And I thought, well, it would be nice if we could simplify the enemies at least, right? Because we want them, like they're not going to be actively trying to break the game the way a player might. So I gave them a much more simple collision system, which was kind of just checking a few points here and there. More old school, you might say, about like if you look up how older games did it, they kind of had like predefined points that they would check against, and if it somehow slipped between those points, tough luck. But I really got sick of having to keep these two collision things in my head. I just didn't like having the two of them, and I didn't like the idea of getting inconsistent results on enemies. And also, it's a little bit harder to test things for enemies. Like, in theory, I could hook one of these guys up to the buttons so that, he does exactly what I tell him to do. But otherwise, we're basically relying on just dropping a load of them into the stage and seeing if they happen to collide with something in a way that, causes a bug to reveal itself, right? Because the bugs just sit and wait until they show themselves and like visually through something that we can actually perceive, I got tired of trying to mentally track, okay, the player does this, but the enemies do that, and maybe that gives slightly different results on a slope or on this or on that. Da, 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 da. So I decided, what if I just give the enemies the more precise collision system? Yes, it's very expensive, but that's the excuse that I need to go back and rework collision entirely and try to make it more efficient. So these guys actually do use a very precise collision system. It's the exact same as the player now. They reuse all the exact same code. But I went back and I worked on collisions from the bottom up, and I refactored every single part of it. And as a result, it's now at least 4 times faster than it was before. And that's actually comparing it just to last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago. The time kind of flew working on this thing. But yeah, let's say 2 weeks ago, it was a certain speed, and now it's 4 times faster. So I think it's probably even much faster compared to where it was in like the initial collision demo that I did. And that demo was called Potentially Acceptable Collisions for a reason, because they were something that I could live with, but I wasn't really happy with. I knew it could be faster, and I knew it could be more robust, and I'm glad to have finally done that now. So it is a lot faster, and I feel a lot more comfortable using it for enemies. It's actually faster, more robust, and easier to understand than it ever has been. So it's basically been a win on every axis that you can get as a programmer, which probably just goes to show what a bad job I did initially. You know what I mean? Like it's not like these are some kind of revolutionary thing that just happens to be so great. It's more just that my earlier attempts at it were inexperienced, and now I've come back with a bit more experience, and I get it more, and blah blah blah. I actually still think, as far as collision systems go, it's probably still fairly expensive because it's using a very pixelated, tile by tile, pixel by pixel approach. Whereas if you use vectors, you can probably do all kinds of clever things there that we can't do when we're just looking at a grid of pixels. So, but the game is pixelated, and I kind of want the pixels to feel real in that way, and so it is what it is. But I'm pretty happy with it. It's been a really nice win to get all these things up and running like this. On top of that, I also streamlined the animation system quite a lot, so that's more efficient as well, and easier to understand, and simpler, fewer lines of code, and blah blah blah. But probably the biggest addition here is collisions. Like I said, they're more robust than they ever have been. Well, what do I mean by that? If we come over here to this, by the way, the scarab is kind of almost looks glitchy there. It's kind of jittering. It's because it just needs to be set up in a more clever way. It's basically catching up to the player. It's a very simple thing. It's very stupidly set up right now, where it catches up to the player, then it stops, but its speed is faster than the player, so it catches up all the time. It keeps catching up and stopping and blah blah blah. Right, so that's why it's jittering like that. Don't worry about that. Yeah, so we have a situation here where we have only a single pixel to work with, right? This thing only has 1 pixel on each side. You can see the green box is my my collision volume, right? And I can actually touch this thing from both sides, so it's actually only a pixel thick, right? Now, the initial collision demo, if you go back to it, the potentially acceptable collisions video, it was a rectangle, and it was an unchanging rectangle, right? And it didn't handle changes at all there. And ever since then, once we got the state machine in, we had all of these bounding box changes. As you can see, even just walking and stopping, it's changing slightly. We have all of these bounding box changes that we need to account for. So I did it in the simplest, easiest way that I could think of, just as a kind of stopgap solution, which is, let's say that we're in the ceiling like this, right? And this is kind of a bad thing. Like you really wouldn't want to set it up this way. You can see that I don't know how easily you can see it, but the green box is not covering my head. It's only going up to the torso, right? That really doesn't make sense. If something, say, shot a projectile at the player character right now, it would not hit his head because there's no thing there. And also his head is clipping into the ceiling, which doesn't look great either, right? We might allow his arm to clip into the ceiling, but not his head, because it's just too much, right? Probably wouldn't look very good if these were actual ceiling tiles, that looked like something rather than just the orange cubes. But Yeah, what I was doing was, if you imagine a point at the center of that box, what I was doing was I was just checking that point up above. Is there something there? Okay, push out of it, right? And pushing ourselves out. But there's two problems with that. It doesn't work if the thing is only a pixel thick, because if this thing grows by several heights, let's say it grows a lot, right? And let's say the next frame we actually go up and cover the head. Well, now we're all the way up here. So if that thing is only actually, why am I trying to hypothetical here when I have one, right? If the bounding box were to grow up to the top of his head right now, we would totally miss that thing in the middle, right? So it's not enough to just check where we're going to be, and it's also not enough to just check a single pixel either, because we might end up in a scenario like this, right? Now, if you see where my center point is, right, imagine I have the same problem in reverse, where when I crouch, for whatever reason, the box extends downwards by several things, which again would be bad, but let's just imagine it, right? Let's imagine it extends down. We're going to miss that ledge completely if we check a point, right? So it's not enough to check just where we're going to be or just the point in front of us. We have to check the line, and we have to check where we were, right? And that's done now. And it actually has very little performance cost as well, which is nice. But basically, you'll see what I mean here, right? Watch the size of the green box. It's quite small vertically, but then as we come up, it grew much bigger, but we still didn't go through the platform. Now, what actually wanted to happen there, what the bounding box wanted to do there, was it wanted to pop out of the ceiling. It wanted to grow into the ceiling and say, "Whoa, I'm all the way up here now." But we detected that there was a collision there, and we pushed the player back out, which is why his head it doesn't collide with the ceiling, right? Now, there are some things, another thing I want to highlight here is that there are some things that you just can't solve programmatically. And I think you have to eventually recognize that, right? There are some things that are just data problems, right? You're just feeding it bad data. And it's important to recognize what they are, because if you don't want to, there are some problems you just don't want to solve, right? It's just a case of saying whoever set up the sprite fucked up, right? When I drew the collision box over the sprite, I fucked up. I drew it in the wrong place, and it's just bad, right? And there's an example of this with the walk. Now, as you can see, when I'm walking, my bounding box is quite wide, right? It's way wider than it should be. We should obviously tighten this up so that, if something comes in at his legs there, it's going to hit him right when it hits the green thing, and it's not going to feel great as a player. We want to tighten it up quite a lot there. For player boxes in particular, you want to be quite tight so that the player doesn't feel like they're being fucked over by bad collision, right? But now, let's just see as an example here, if I get close to the edge here, right? I happen to know that my standing bounding box is thinner, right? Now, I only have 1 pixel left here. So, I'm walking. What happens if I stop? And in this game, I can stop on, there's no sliding or nothing like that. There's no momentum, right? I can stop on the exact frame that I let go of the stop button. And I know that as a player. But what happens if I stop right here? Well, my bounding box shrinks, and then, we fell down, right? And that's a data problem. It's just a data problem. There's just no way of, we can come up with some, magic pixie dust bullshit solution that somehow pretends that you didn't fall off, but you did, right? Because that's what the bounding box says happened. So, that's what needs to happen, right? I missed it there, but anyway. So there are some things that we just can't solve this way. But in situations where the bounding box grows rather than shrinks, we can at least say, no, you don't get to move in here. You don't get to clip into the ceiling just because you happen to change state at the wrong time or whatever. You're forced out, right? And even then, there are some situations where we have a floor and a ceiling that are close to each other, and maybe that's not going to work properly, but it's pretty robust. It's nice and robust, and it means that we just have to care a lot less about how precisely these bounding boxes on different states align with each other, right? We can get away with a lot more, and we can do things like have the player go into a slide and get their box, like the box changes shape quite a lot there when you go into a slide, and that's nice. It's nice to have the freedom to be able to do that. Again, I don't think the player character is going to do that, but maybe we have an enemy that slides, right? Maybe we have an enemy that gets within a certain distance to you, and then it goes, whoa, and it tries to slide at you, and you're supposed to jump over it or whatever, right? And we want to be able to change the box on that, so that's good. Okay, very last thing to to show off is the ghost. All right, hopefully it hasn't been too distracting. It's pretty faint. Now, I want to preface this one. I cannot say this enough. I really have no fucking idea if this is going to make it into the game. I don't know if it's a good idea. I don't know if it's going to make it in. I just don't know anything about this yet, but it's kind of a theory thing that I think you might be interested in, right? Okay, another reason why I wanted to speed up the collision system and why I have so many enemies in this box. There are actually 65 fleas in this box, right? And you might think that's a peculiar number to choose, and it is, right? I wanted to get 50 going, and this easily handles 50 now, by the way. It already handled 50 before I got the massive 4x improvement on it, right? But I wanted to make sure we had overhead so that when we start adding art assets and we start adding other things to the game, that it doesn't like bog down so much, right? So I wanted to at least have 50 enemies moving around, and that's way more than we'll ever need because we can deactivate them when they move a certain distance off screen or whatever. So if even having 10 enemies in a game like this on screen is going to be plenty to deal with. That would be a ton to deal with. That would be a very stressful situation, I think. And they're not all going to be simple ones like this. Some of them might be shooting projectiles at you or otherwise trying to hit you from far away or whatever, right? So 10 enemies, quite a lot for a game like this, I would say, right? So being able to handle 50 is good because we want to have a lot of overhead, right? And then being able to handle 15 on top of 50 would be nice, because it relates to the ghost, right? So the ghost, again, please do not be disappointed if this doesn't make it into the game. Maybe it just isn't a good idea, right? And maybe it's just too expensive, too much of a waste of resources. I don't know. But and it's actually, another thing is just that it's a very finicky thing to set up, right? And it's not working correctly right now, and it's been finicky, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully trust it, right? Because it is such a finicky thing to do. That maybe I'll just pull it out, right? But take this speculatively. Okay. Right now, the enemies are reacting to where I am. As you can see, if I move over here, they're jumping to where I am, right? But what I want to do is I want to have two different player characters in the game world. One that's real, that's you, and one which is a fake one, which I'm calling the player prediction, right? Now, what we could do, this is all to factor in reaction time for enemies, right? It would be nice if the enemies didn't know exactly where you were, but know where you were like 150 milliseconds ago or 200 milliseconds ago. I think 15 times a frame takes about 16 milliseconds at 60 FPS, I think. So that times 15 works out to be around 250 milliseconds, I think, somewhere around there, right? So we might tighten it up to 12 frames maybe to get it around 200 milliseconds. If I remember right, human audio reaction time is about 150 milliseconds, and for visual that's about 250 milliseconds. So we might split the difference and try and get them somewhere in that 200 millisecond range. But the point is that we want them to have some kind of reaction time, if possible, right? We don't want them to have perfect knowledge about where you are right now. Now that, if it was just pushing the player back 200 milliseconds, that would be very easy. In fact, the after images that were in prior videos are basically just that, right? You store a list of positions of where the player was over the last 20 frames, and then, or 15 frames or whatever we're doing, and then you just pull that off, right? You could do it as a queue, let's say. You push it onto the queue, 15 frames later it comes off the queue, and that's where we were 15 frames ago. And that's very easy to do, and that's what the after images were doing. They were just drawing a sprite at those positions, right? So that's clearly not what I'm doing here, right? Because this is something else. The thing is, now, I want the enemies in this game to be somewhat intelligent, right? I know that these are just fleas and they jump around, right? But, and I know they're going to be stupid. Like, in the grand scheme of things, compared to a human intellect, of course they're going to be really dumb, right? But it's not the kind of game where I go, oh, they're based on insects and therefore they have really low intelligence. There's a bit of a society to this game, right? They exist, right? They're real things in some sense, right? They should have some level of intellect to them, right? They're maybe not up on our level as humans, but they're not as far off as you might think just because they happen to look like insects, right? And therefore it'd be nice if we could get that little bit more life into them, right? So you're an intelligent creature, hopefully, right? And you know that if a ball is coming at you, and you catch it out of the corner of your eye, right? You don't try to grab the ball 150 milliseconds after it hits your face, right? You see where the ball is and you project it forward in time to react to it in that way, right? Therefore, I think it would be cool to do something similar with the player character. And this is why I wanted the collision system to be fast, because the way that I see this working right now, and maybe there's a better way that I'll come up with, but the way that I see this working in the most robust, most trustworthy way right now is that we store the player's position and their state, 12 frames later, 15 frames later, whatever it is, we pop that off the queue, and then we simulate that to catch up with reality, right? So we simulate based on what the enemy knows, which is in the past, right? Based on what the enemy knows you were doing 200 milliseconds ago, what does it think you have done in the meantime, right? Because it's an intelligent thing. It knows that just because you were there 150 milliseconds ago doesn't mean you're there now, right? If you're in a walking state, you can see that this doesn't work under some conditions, but it does work for a walking state, right? If you're in a walking state, after a momentary delay, the prediction catches up with reality, right? Because it sees that you're walking and it goes, okay, it knows where you are, right? So that's why there's a slight delay where when we start walking, the ghost stays there for a moment and then it instantly catches up with reality. As soon as the enemy realizes, oh, you're walking, right? That knows you're walking, right? Once it has had time to react. I think this is a little bit strange and a little bit counterintuitive to wrap your head around because you're seeing both the player character and the ghost, but you just have to kind of factor it in as a reaction time, right, in your head, right? And likewise, if I'm walking and I stop, the enemy predicts that I'm going to walk a little bit further than I actually do because they don't realize that I've stopped, right? They assume that I'm going to stay in the same state for those 15 frames, but I actually didn't, right? I stopped right there, which means that they predicted that I'm going to walk forward a little bit. And you can see how maybe this adds a little bit of nuance to the game. Like imagine there's some guy standing on top of the box and he's waiting for me and he's going to jump down on me or something. You know, maybe if I stand here and I walk here, I can kind of bait him out a little bit, right? I can bait out a shot from some guy who's going to shoot me from off screen. I can bait it out and then I can go in, right? Maybe. That's the theory. And I think there are things like this in games. There's almost certainly something... I say almost certainly. I don't know. I'd have to go back and play it. But there's almost certainly something like this in Resident Evil 4. Because if you are running up to a Ganado, basically like you can be near a Ganado and then run at them. And it knows that you're going to be near it. It knows that you're in a running state and you're nearby. Maybe it's just that simple. It's like if you're in a running state, moving towards it and within a certain radius, then it lunges at you. But like you can kind of bait them into lunging at you by running forward a little bit. I don't think it's doing a simulation the way this is, right? I think it seems a little bit too reactive for that, but I don't know. I also noticed this playing Bayonetta, where, and it could just be my imagination, but it feels like affinities try to, like if you're falling down and an affinity happens to be where Bayonetta is going to land, it feels like they try to hit you where you're going to be. Like it feels like they have some way of knowing you are coming down to the ground and now I'm going to hit you, right? And it really catches you out. Like it feels intelligent when it happens. It feels like something that's, oh, okay, like this thing is switched on. Like it knows that I'm falling and that I'm going to hit the ground. So it doesn't just, it's not stupid enough to go, oh, Bayonetta's not in range. Like it knows. And again, I could just be imagining that. Maybe it's just that it doesn't even check the y-axis, right? Maybe it just gets close to you and it sees that you're there. And like it doesn't matter that you're 100 feet above it. It thinks that it's close enough and it hits. And it just happens to hit you sometimes when you fall. But it's inspired by things like that anyway, where it feels like the enemy kind of gets you, right? And I think one reason that I like it is it seems like something we can get away with because this is a 2D game. And if I do a good enough job on the programming, there should be plenty of overhead to do little things like that where we can do them. So I think, like, as you can see, it kind of works, right? There's at least one thing it's not doing properly, which means that it's just not working in a way that I'm happy with. I don't know. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to fully trust it. Part of the reason is because the way structs work in Game Maker is a little bit opaque. I get why they're doing what they're doing. They use shallow copies instead of deep copies most of the time. or all of the time, which hides some of the complexity from more novice users. But it also kind of means that I'm not quite sure whether I have a full deep copy of the player character that I can really manipulate without interfering with the player character. Like before I started addressing that problem, the prediction would interfere with the player character. So let's say worst case scenario, I start sliding along the ground. Well, once the prediction started sliding, my friction just went off the charts. Like I came to a stop almost instantly because both of them were applying to the same thing. And that's a worst case scenario. That's terrible. I really can't have that happening, right? The player character's movement can't be interfered with this thing at all. So it's a delicate balancing act of making sure that we can reuse all of the player code and do all of the things that the player is doing and grab all of the relevant variables and all that, but not actually interfere with the player in any way at all, right? So I have to be utterly convinced of that before I allow this thing to go into the game. And I'm not right now. It's not there. It's definitely not there. But maybe I can get it in by the end. So a little bit of theory, and hey, it's a development video. Sometimes things don't make it, right? And I'm honestly not sure if it's worth it, because as you can see, there is a whole question of once we've been in a state for 15 frames, right? This thing should know what we're doing. Now we can throw it off by moving left or right. Like if we're falling through the air and we have mid-air movement, it's not going to necessarily know the exact position in the air. Like it could drift out of position depending on what the player does. But if for simple scenarios, at least, like where we're just walking along, once we've been doing that for 15 frames, the prediction lines up exactly with reality anyway, right? So maybe we need to project it even further forward than where the player is to get these things reacting intelligently, but that means simulating more collision and more animation and more stuff like that. And we do need to animate it because the bending box might change. And yes, we do need to, there's a lot of things we need to do to make sure that this prediction is accurate to reality, So it's quite expensive. If we consider it to be a single thing in the game, like a single object, it is by far the most expensive object in the game doing this prediction. Let me put it that way, right? In terms of performance cost, it's by far the most expensive thing because it's the equivalent of 15 other actors all by itself, more or less, right? We save a little bit of overhead by not having to switch between actors and all that kind of stuff, but very expensive. Maybe there's a way for me to bring the cost down. I could see that being true, but if we really wanted to match reality, I don't see any other way. Like if we want to really trust it and believe in it, then I don't see any other way other than just doing all those 15 frames exactly the way the player would have, So yeah, I'm not sure that makes sense. Hopefully it makes sense to you, what I'm trying to accomplish with that. It might be a little bit difficult to understand, but yeah, that's something that I'm working on. And and by the way, these are all temp sprites for the fleas. They especially the glide. The glide was drawn by me and is really bad. But yeah, yeah, we're working on it. Yeah, so that's all I have for now. Hopefully there was some interesting stuff in here, and I don't know. I got nothing else to say, so I'll see you next time. Okay. Thanks for watching. Oh yeah, I do have one more thing to say. Considering that I do nothing to promote these videos, or whatever, they get a lot of views. I know that being a developer is a struggle, being an indie developer, and part of that struggle is just getting anybody to pay attention to your game at all. So for what these videos are, I think they get quite a lot of views. So first of all, I hope you get something out of it. I hope it's worth your time. But secondly, thanks for tuning in anyway, right? Yeah, it's nice to have some interest, and I don't know. Thanks for tuning in. All right. Yeah, I'll see you next time. I don't know when that will be, but hopefully there was enough to chew on here. And thanks for watching. See you, everybody.